It is with great honor and pleasure that I introduce Dr. Elisabeth Wegner as your speaker today. Ellie, who's everyone knows her as Ellie, actually has been in our department for quite some time. She is an associate professor in the Department of OBGYN and Reproductive Medicine. Ellie received her undergraduate degree at UVM here, then went to University of Connecticut for her medical degree, and then came back for her residency and has been here since. Ellie has really played a pivotal role in our department in many ways. She has had many leadership positions both nationally and within our department. She has been our residency director for our OBGYN residency program. She has been the director of our benign GYN service, setting the tone for benign OBGYN. She's the director of colposcopy, which she'll talk a little bit about today, and she's also the director of our GYN ultrasound unit. Ellie has received many accolades from our department, our medical school, including teaching awards from our medical students and residents. Perhaps probably for me, one of the biggest roles that she has done and the biggest responsibility that she has done has been, she's been a great friend, but more importantly, she is actually the physician to my wife and my daughter. So it says a lot because I handpicked her to take care of both my wife and my daughter. Ellie has been interested in this topic for a very long time, since, well, I'll just say a very long time. And she actually was the lead site investigator for one of the clinical trials that she will talk about, looking at the HPV vaccine. So it was under her leadership that eventually was able to recruit patients and then eventually became FDA approved. So without hesitation, it is with great honor and privilege to introduce Ellie Wagner as your speaker tonight.
Okay, I think this is off now. Okay, can you all hear me fine and everything? So I'm pretty excited to talk about this topic. As Dr. Wong mentioned, I've had interest in this for a long time. And the other day I was thinking to myself, when was the first time that I really thought about the human papilloma virus? And I realized that when I was in medical school, I had a roommate who was an architect in this condo place, and she had come home one day and said, you know, I had to have this procedure done on my cervix for pre-cancer, and they said it was caused by a virus. And you know, this was a long time ago, and I thought, a virus that causes cancer? I've never heard of that, you know, and here I was in medical school. So, and that was my first real introduction to HPV. And then when I was in later in medical school and then in residency, I became familiar with this and then became director of our colposcopy unit. And I've spent probably, I'll tell you, the last 25 years spending a lot of time with HPV. And it's, to me, one of the most amazing stories and interesting topics in science that we have. And there's a lot of material that you accumulate after 25 years, so I've tried really hard to have a taste of everything for you in 1 hour. And I apologize if it seems like a lot. And I will be jumping a little bit back and forth, mainly because, and I'll just throw up the talk overview here, there's two timelines, really. One is sort of papilloma virus timeline, and the other timeline is sort of cervical cancer. And they do eventually overlap and are very intertwined. But to give you sort of some familiarity, I start off with more the sort of cervical cancer, and there may be something infectious or something's causing cervical cancer, and then I switch a little bit to papilloma viruses and the human papilloma virus, and sort of the last half of the talk's more about the sexually transmitted human papilloma viruses which cause cervical and other cancers. So hopefully that will keep you on track. But I'm going to just start by building a case for a sexually transmitted cancer, because, you know, people really didn't think of this, you know, this was sort of how that could be was hard for scientists and physicians for a while to figure that out. I'm going to talk about an extraordinary woman and her cervical cancer called the HeLa cells, immortal cells that are used in research. And then I'm going to switch gears a little and say, you know, what is human papilloma virus, where did it come from, and talk about our ancient ancestors, including fish, and then how the virus causes cancer. You know, how can a virus cause cancer? How can it cause immortal cells? And then last, talk a little bit about how we prevent it in the HPV vaccine and some of the controversies that have come up with this vaccine. So, and then I know we have time for questions afterwards, which I think will be interesting to me. So, even back in the Greek days, there was some knowledge about condyloma and viruses, not viruses, but warts and things like that. But really, the first reports that we can see in the 1800s in Italy, there was a professor, Rigoni Stern, who reported that cervical cancer was uncommon amongst unmarried women and very rare in nuns, and then this was reconfirmed later in the nun area, and this was sort of known for quite some time, that women that had little sexual activity or little birth, I mean, usually because there wasn't birth control, if you were sexually active, you were getting pregnant and having babies. So if those women who either weren't married or were nuns and really weren't sexually active and weren't having pregnancies rarely had cervical cancer. Then Virchow, who's famous in medicine for many things, had noted cervical cancers related to sexual behavior and number of births. And there was sort of speculation, well, is it something to do with cervical trauma or infections during birth? What is it? And then in the mid-1950s in Denmark, Rogel notes that cervical cancer is higher in prostitutes. And so again, here's the sexual connection, what's going on. And in the 70s is when things really took off. People did a lot of these epidemiologic studies or studies that look at sort of populations and look and say, oh, in this group we see a lot of women with this behavior have this condition, et cetera. And they noticed that cervical cancer is associated with women who had early onset of sexual intercourse, multiple partners, and other sort of sexual risk factors. And in the 70s also there was this high-risk male, and the high-risk male was someone whose first wife had died of cervical cancer and then subsequently had another wife develop precancer or cervical cancer. And they're like, well, what's going on? What's being transmitted here? And what people were seeing was they at first thought, well, maybe there's something in the semen or there's some proteins or something that's in the area under the uncircumcised foreskin that may be, because they knew that in certain populations where circumcision was performed on men, that there seemed to be less of the cervical cancer. So they thought, well, maybe that's the issue. And then because sexually transmitted diseases we know travel together, they tend to like to travel with each other. People thought chlamydia or genital herpes, and there was quite a bit of evidence for genital herpes, even when I remember being in medical school, not trying to date myself here, but in the 80s, people really still thought genital herpes may be causative because it was found in a higher frequency in women with precancer, cervical cancer, and also even noted sometimes to be in cancer cells. Well, that was just a coincidence. But all along, people had noted precancer cervical changes as people were looking at the cervix under the microscope, and histologic and biopsies and pap smears had come around, and they'd noticed it describing these kind of papillomatous changes at the same time and trying to kind of figure that all out. And then when we had more sophisticated scientific ways of investigating cells in the 80s, where they actually they hybridized within cells that had precancer and cancer. For the DNA of viruses, they were able to detect the human papilloma virus, and they could find in the circulation antibodies to this. And so Harald Zerhausen actually reported and was credited with the discovery that cervical cancer is caused by papilloma viruses. And he was awarded in 2008 the Nobel Prize. This is the quote from the website there, that for the discovery of the causative role of papilloma virus in cancer of the cervix, and led to the development of successful HPV vaccine. So infections that cause cancers. There's only a handful, really, that we're aware of currently in humans worldwide. There is H. pylori is a particular virus that can cause stomach cancer. HPV can cause cervical and some others that I'll talk about. Hepatitis B and C can cause liver cancers. There are certain types of viruses that can cause Kaposi sarcoma, which was seen a lot with HIV individuals and a few others here. When we look, 500,000 women per year get cervical cancer. It's only about 400,000 or 10,000 in the United States, about 400,000 die per year in the United States, and that's because we screen for, a lot of countries don't screen, unfortunately, for cervical cancer, so it is devastating. And when you look, more than half of all infection-attributable cancers in women worldwide are human papillomavirus, and we have an effective vaccine. It's just, shocking to me that this is continuing to be an issue, but it is. So, let's go to our next slide, maybe. So that's just to set the stage a little bit about sort of cervical cancer, sexually transmitted. I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit now about Henrietta Lacks. If anyone here has not read this book, I would highly recommend it. It came out, I think, in about the late 2000s, and Rebecca Schlut actually came to UVM and spoke. I was able to see her talk here. It was great. But she writes about this woman back in 1951, over 30 years before we recognized that HPV was causing cervical cancer. This woman, Henrietta Lacks, died of an extremely aggressive cervical cancer, like off the charts. It really rapidly took her life. And unknown to her family, the cancer cells were taken after her surgery and used in medical research, which was very common at that time, that cancer cells retrieved in the operating room were often brought to the lab and used, and there was no kind of medical ethics about getting informed consent. And still today it's debated, really, do those cells belong to that individual? And it's interesting, and the book gets into that quite a bit. But medical research, this is just incredible. This is a plaque to Henrietta Lacks down in Roanoke, and basically if you look down here, it says that she died October 4th, 1951, and cell tissue was removed without permission, as was the usual then for medical research, and her cells have multiplied and survived at an extraordinary high rate and are renowned worldwide as the HeLa line, the gold standard of cell lines. And one of the many things it's done is Jonah Salk's developed his polio vaccine by using the HeLa cells. So why are they called HeLa cells? Well, Henrietta Lacks, the first two letters of her first and last name come up with the HeLa cell. And they were taken from her at the time after her tumor was moved at surgery. And this is the first human cell line to grow in a lab naturally, indefinitely, and basically are considered immortal in the sense that as long as you give them nutrients, they continue to divide and reproduce, and they have since 1951. And they've just never stopped. They're the oldest and most commonly used human cell line in labs all over the world. Most cells, if you take a biopsy of any of our skin cells, our body cells, and you put them in a petri dish and give them nutrients, they'll divide a couple of times, and then they automatically die because they're programmed not to continue for various reasons. And hers just keep going. So in 2010, almost 8 years ago, scientists at that time had grown over 20 tons of HeLa cells worldwide. Over 60,000 scientific articles using these cells, and at least 300 papers per month at that time and continuing. Over 11,000 patents using these cells. And one of the downsides to these cells, they're really miraculous cells, is when they're in a lab, if they get by air or by any kind of contamination into some other cell culture, they're so dominant that they overtake. So a lot of research has been contaminated, and unfortunately results are fraught because they thought they had a different cell line and ended up being HeLa cell lines. So that's been a big issue, unfortunately. These cells are so famous that Oprah Winfrey has actually portrayed the daughter of Henrietta Lacks in a movie that came out on HBO in 2017. You probably could still get that if you wanted to, but very well known. So this is an image of the HeLa cells with special dyes, looking at their nucleus and then just in the cytoplasm. So why can a cell line infected with a papilloma virus become immortal? I mean, what is it that this papilloma virus is doing that it causes this aggressive cancer and makes this cell immortal? Well, what are papillomaviruses and where did they come from? So papilloma, if we break this down, papilloma means a warty or finger-like growth from Latin. And so everyone knows the garden variety warts that people have. You have plantar warts, you can have warts on skin all over the place. And then virus is basically an infectious agent that reproduces inside the host cell. And they're forced to reproduce cells. And so what basically happens is you have this little protein shell. This is the papillomavirus, or this is the flu virus, and it attaches to some cell in our body, and then it gets inside and it uses the cellular machinery of us to reproduce thousands of little particles of virus that then it bursts out and looks for the next victim during flu season or whatever. So that's what a virus is. The papilloma virus in particular, it's a large DNA virus, like HIV is an RNA virus, but papilloma viruses are DNA, and most of our cells have DNA in them. We also have RNA, but our basic what code that we give from cell to cell, generation to generation, is DNA. And it infects skin, basically. Skin like on our arms and legs, the hands and feet, but also infects skin like mucosa skin, which is skin that's inside the mouth, the throat, the anus, and the vagina, and in the cervix. Most of the time, people have no idea they have these. We live all the time with viruses and bacteria. I mean, we are just friends with these in our environment, and a lot of times they cause no symptoms. Some papillomaviruses cause warty growths on the skin, and some are capable of causing cancer. What you need to know is in the family of papillomaviruses, there are papillomaviruses that infect cows and rabbits and giraffes and you name the mammal. There are a lot of mammals have papillomaviruses, but if a giraffe with a wart comes up and rubs you or a cow, that wart doesn't want to live on a cow or someone else. It really likes the giraffe. So giraffe papillomaviruses stick with giraffes, etc. The other thing is not only is the papillomavirus like a particular species, different types of papillomaviruses like different areas of the body. So if you have a plantar wart and you rub that against your nose, it's not going to cross, but if you put it on your other hand, you might cross because hand papillomaviruses like hand area, etc. So there's over 300 types of papillomavirus currently that we're aware of, and 200 that are human. That's because we study humans so much. I think if we looked largely into other mammals, we could probably subdivide those. And where they all come from? Well, a long, long time ago, over 400 million years ago, try and grasp that one, we had fish relatives. So we came from the fish, and they hosted a papillomavirus. And the papillomaviruses have been co-evolving with every species along the way. Some it stayed with and others it haven't. And mainly it's in mammals now, some birds and reptiles. The human papillomaviruses are simply the papillomaviruses that were present as humans first emerged. And so they're called human papillomaviruses. But they share the same ancestral root with all the other mammal and bird and reptile and now fish. So if we look at, there's an international committee on taxonomy. This is the most, sorry if there's anyone out here that goes to this website, but it is a really boring website that I went to for the first time for this talk. And it's just amazing the debates that go back and forth on this website. But this is the official, most recent tree of papillomavirus. So here's our original 400, this is probably 330 million year ago papillomavirus that split into these different subgroups over time. And so most of these you can see are HPV because we know over 200. But if you look over here, this is the bovine papillomavirus. This is the cotton-tail rabbit papillomavirus, etc. So these are our different papillomaviruses. And this is, they basically all kind of look the same, honestly. Their DNA is a little bit different, but their basic structure is very similar. Recently, this is the sort of fish part of all this, is that most of the papillomaviruses, as I said, are from mammals, but there are 5 birds and 3 reptile species that have this. And so originally, scientists thought that the split must have happened, that the papillomaviruses occurred before the split between mammals, reptiles, and birds, which was about 330 million years ago. But these are papillomas on this fish. I got it from this paper where it just was published. So it's been detected in a fish, and that puts the date back to about 400 million years at the time that there were ray-finned fishes. So this is just an example. Sorry. This is a cow papilloma virus. They don't really hurt the animals usually unless they obstruct something like the mouth or vision or something like that. And this is, for any of you who've had dogs, I mean, I grew up with dogs, and often they had these little, and they would get to a certain size and just fall off, and that's pretty classic. So this is just a German Shepherd with a little papilloma virus. Now, so if this cow rubbed up to this dog, there would be no problem. If this cow rubbed another cow, though, it might, and there's trauma to the skin, it might get the papilloma virus from the other cow. That's the grossest picture I have today. I could have gone way worse, but so there you are. So we're going to shift gears and talk now strictly about human papilloma virus. So it's a protein shell, and inside this protein shell that has all these little protein pieces is this circular double-stranded DNA. We know there's over 200 types of HPV, 40 that infect the genital tract, and 15 are considered high risk or oncogenic or cancer causing, able to cause cancer. Remarkably, HPV evolution's been extremely slow, so there's been not a lot of change. So between the fish papilloma and the human papilloma, there's not been a lot of dramatic change, whereas the fish to the human looks pretty different. So, and we can look at different HPV types in subvariants within them that have been changing for over 2,000 years, and these actually can help a little with human migration because we can find ancestral changes that go along with the HPV. It's kind of an interesting offshoot. So here is the HPV. These are the roughly 200 plus HPVs in a circular form. Here's their original, ancestor that they all, and then they split into these different, they call it the alpha, beta, gamma, mu, different subgroups. And the red ones up here are the cancer-causing ones, okay? The 15 that are associated and considered pre-cancer. The rest are either warts or they cause you no symptoms whatsoever. So cancers in humans that are known to be caused by the human papilloma virus. This slide shows us in red the total number of cancers per year in the US, so about 12,000. And of those that are attributable to HPV, it's close to 90+%. It really is felt worldwide that almost all cervical cancers, near all, are caused by HPV. Vaginal cancer is not very common, but most of them are HPV. Vulvar cancer, it's more like 2/3 to 3/4 are HPV related. Penile cancer, there's about half of those are HPV related. Anal and rectal more commonly, and then oral pharyngeal cancers. And these are the ones that are known to be HPV, cancers caused by HPV. So another limelight moment for HPV was, I don't know if you all remember, but Michael Douglas, 7 years ago, was diagnosed with throat cancer. And he came out and said, well, I got HPV throat cancer, and so I got it from oral sex. And this was big news for a long time. And it's still, this is from a website in 2017, that he's been 7 years free of his HPV-associated cancer. And if you want to know more about it, go to the website. But, this was dramatic. I remember when it came out in the news because it really terrified. And it was one of the times where I saw all of a sudden people thought, well, maybe I will give my son the HPV vaccine. Before that, people weren't so keen on that. Now, if you were going to make a vaccine to HPV that causes cancer, you would probably pick HPV type 16 because this causes the majority of human HPV cancers. Although there's 15 types that can cause cancer, the vast majority, over 50% in cervix and all the other cancers are usually HPV 16. So if you look at cervical, vaginal, vulvar cancers, the blue is HPV 16. That's the big guy. 18 is another biggie. So 70% of these are caused by either 16, 18. If you look at anal rectal, it's really mostly 16. Oral pharyngeal, it's really 16. And penile, heavily 16. So if you were a pharmaceutical company, you would focus on 16 and maybe 18. Almost all genital warts are caused by HPV 6 and 11. So, and I didn't put a slide in, but that's good to know. So number of cancers caused by HPV in the US per year. If you look at women, about 10,000 plus cervical cancers, not that many oropharyngeal. For men, it's much higher in oropharyngeal. It's felt that difference is because women get exposed usually vaginally, and they can build their own immunity, so they get a little less oropharyngeal, whereas men don't get quite the same exposure. They get it on their penis, but it doesn't tend to get, their immune system doesn't react to it the same way women's do. So this just gives you a sense of sort of the total volume per year in the US. So we're going to shift one more time here. So we're talking about first papillomaviruses, human papillomavirus, and now we're really going to look at just the sexually transmitted precancers and cancers of the cervix caused by HPV, and that's really my area of expertise. So it was first noted when they started doing pap smears, which is a way of wiping the cells of the cervix to screen for cervical cancer. That was started in the late 40s, early 50s. George Papanikolaou from Greece did a lot of this work. But there were people that were looking at slides. After you wipe a cervix, you'd make a single cell layer of cells and then put stains on it, look on the side. And they noticed that in skin cells that had been exposed to human papillomavirus, they had these lesions that they called coilocytic atypia or coilocytosis, and it means hollow from the Greek word koilos. And that was sort of this association, the first association. They didn't realize that was what was causing the cancer or related to cancer. They just noticed that papillomavirus and warty change and other things sometimes were associated with these. It wasn't until '83 really that we understood it was causative. But people were describing these cellular changes. Just as an anatomy review for folks, this is a picture of a woman. This is the vaginal area. And this is the cervix. There's outer skin here, just like the skin on our arms and legs called squamous skin. There is some inner skin called glandular skin of the cervix. Most of the cervical cancers are the squamous or outer skin. Then this is the womb or the uterus where, and your ovaries. So this is the area we're talking about, the cervix, the outer and inner area. And this is a biopsy from a normal cervix. This is the outer cell that is the cells that's on the vagina and the outer part of the cervix, and this is the inner skin cell. Look at how thick that layer is, and that's basically a protective layer. So if you, like with your arm or legs or vagina, if you come against something or rub something or have anything like that, in order to prevent the skin from splitting or from bacteria or infection getting through, you like having this barrier here. And basically what happens is these bottom cells, they have reserve cells. So what they do is they reproduce, split, and then as they grow towards the surface, they mature and they flatten out. And that's basically what gives you this kind of squamous cell. And this is important for you to understand that this is the cells that keep regenerating and have all the DNA that kind of program what happens coming up here. Where these two cell types meet in adolescence, this skin area changes as the vaginal pH changes, as someone has their hormones turning on for puberty. And as this cell type changes, it goes through what we call metaplasia. It's extremely vulnerable to the HPV virus, and that's often where the virus infects and causes precancers and cancers. And so this is an area that we monitor closely on women who have abnormal paps. So this is a schematic or cartoon of this cell layer here. We're going to just ignore the glandular cell for now. So, and this is normal. So you have your bottom cells, they split, and as they mature and get towards the top, they flatten out, make this protective layer that protects you against, infection and tears and things like that. When you get an HPV infection, initially the virus gets in and it lives outside of the nucleus and outside of the human DNA. The viral DNA just kind of sits in here, and it takes control of some of the cell machinery, and it reproduces itself, and you get a lot of shedding of the virus. Over time, it can then be less shedding and just make the cells more abnormal looking, and then eventually the viral DNA can insert itself into our human DNA in this basal layer. And if it does that, it can overexpress some of its genes that make it more likely to convert into a cancer. This is basically what a pap smear of an early change. So if we were going to look at an infectious cell that's making a lot of virus, at the top we wipe these cells. This is what they would look like. This is a normal cell that's not infected. This is one that's got a lot of virus in it that's getting ready to burst out into the environment. And that's that coilocyte that people had noted in the 1950s. This is a pap smear of what cancer cells look like. They're very irregular. Their nucleus looks scary. This is a normal cell, and this is just totally a bizarre looking cell. And we don't see that very often on our pap smears because of our screening and vaccination. But this is a biopsy of the skin that shows this high-grade dysplasia. So the cells aren't flattening out as you get higher. They're not doing what they're normally supposed to, and there's mitotic figures and other things. This is pre-cancer of the cervix. And if you look here, here's the pre-cancer biopsy, and this is our normal. And you can see that looks very different. And even these cells look a little different. This is a pre-cancer of the glandular epithelium, and both of these are HPV-related changes. And so when we have someone come in who gets an abnormal pap smear, we look and we do a biopsy, and if we see something like this, we treat their cervix before it becomes cancer with a simple office procedure. But if they go on to a true cancer, then it's much more life-threatening, and they need a bigger surgery. So, one more shift here. How does HPV cause cancer? We know HPV infections are incredibly common. I'm going to talk about that. But what is the mechanism for the times that it does cause cancer? And it's important to know that from exposure to HPV to cancer is probably 10 or 20 years at least, unless your immune system's really on the fritz. You know, you've had a kidney transplant, you're on immunosuppressive medicines, or you have HIV or something like that. Otherwise, if you have a normal immune system, it would be rare that you'd be exposed and then end up with cancer in less than 10 to 20 years. It really takes a long time. But how does it cause cancer? Well, one of the things HPV does extremely well, it's spent 400 million years learning to do this, is it evades the immune system. So it infects. Often you have micro trauma to your skin, and it gets in at that basal layer, and it infects those renewing cells at the bottom, but it doesn't integrate its DNA at that point. It just sort of takes over the machinery, but it doesn't make its particles until it's in the top layer. So it's well away from our blood supply and other immune sources that we have, defenses in our body, by the time it sheds the virus at the top layer. So this helps it escape it. The second bigger mechanism, what really makes the HeLa cell and the immortal cell and makes the cancer cells in us, is that when the DNA from the virus inserts into our DNA on that basal cell layer, it inserts into our own genetic nuclear DNA, the way it gets spliced and cut in, it starts turning on a high production of two of the viral proteins called E6 and E7. And these interfere with normal cellular processes that usually tell the cells to die if they're growing irregularly. We have these very nice tumor suppressor proteins that protect us when our DNA gets sun damaged, or we have a chemical exposure, or just a bad day for the cell that divides wrong. And so basically we have these little guards in the cell that go around and say, okay, your job, you're a bad cell. We're just gonna kill you. You're gonna self-destruct. So these prevent the proteins that normally turn the cell off, and it also causes this thing that's called a telomerase to increase. And telomerase allows a cell line to divide without reaching a limit. So we usually have a low amount of this, but if you have a large amount of this, you can grow indefinitely or immortally, and that's really what the HeLa cell, it has all of these things, but this is why they continue to grow without dying. So the 15 different types of HPV that cause cervical cancer are a little different by regions of the world, but as you can see, again, this orange is HPV 16 and yellow is HPV 18. So the vast majority of, again, 70% of cancers of the cervix are 16 and 18. But it's important to know that most genital HPV exposure results only in a very brief infection and not cervical cancer. And this is really a tricky point I see patients all the time. They come in freaked out. Oh my goodness, I'm HPV 16 or 18 positive, or I'm the whole panel positive. I have one of these, I'm going to die of cancer. I'm like, no, I mean, the most people I see that have this never have pre-cancer or cancer. So cancer-causing HPV are sexually transmitted. They're incredibly common. If you look at studies in the US and other countries in the world where they've done it, 30% of young women, and probably men, but we don't study them to the same extent, become infected within 24 months of their first sexual exposure. So in the first 2 years, when they've done all these incredible college studies, they'll see that women come in and they initiate sexual activity. They're obviously getting the HPV from the men they're having sex with, but they're not being tested or followed the same way the women are. And then they clear these. They often can get a mild cervical change that may never even be detected. They may never even be picked up on a pap. They may nothing, and 90% of the time they just completely clear in 2 years, and that's the end of it. If they have long-term persistence, if they happen to have a really nasty HPV that eludes the immune system and somehow integrates into their basal cell layer, into the DNA, then those are the ones that can become cancer, but it takes, again, 10, 20 years before a true cancer. They can get the high-grade or pre-cancer change within a year or two, but the true invasive, life-threatening cancer takes a long time. So most men and women will be infected at least with one type of genital HPV at some point in their lives. It's estimated that at least up to 80 million people, as we sit here today in America, probably have HPV actively an infection, and per year 14 million new ones. And it's the most common in young people in their teens and their 20s, and most people never know they had it. Probably 3 out of 4 people by the time they're 49 or 50 will have been exposed. I tell most people when they walk into clinic, I'm like, if you've been sexually active, you've probably been exposed to HPV. I mean, it's just that pervasive. And it's just something we live with and usually doesn't cause us problems. So this is an old slide, but it represents pretty well. Annual burden of genital HPV-related disease in U.S. females, about 4,000 women still die of cervical cancer, preventable, most of those now with a vaccine. 10,000 with new cases, 33,000 cases of pre-cancer or high-grade dysplasia per year, 1 million cases of genital warts, and 1 million plus cases of low-grade dysplasias. So 3 million cases per year of HPV disease in the United States, roughly, probably a little more. So what did people decide to do about this? Well, the first pharmaceutical company that was able to get a FDA-approved vaccination was Merck, and they came out in 2005 and 2006 with this huge ad campaign, Are You Ready for the Future? Because they had gotten this vaccine studied. It took well more than a decade of incredible research and a lot of serendipity to come up with a really impressive vaccine. I'll let you hear more about that. But we get vaccines, we get all sorts of things all the time that are discovered, and they don't go to the Wall Street Journal, they don't end up in Forbes or the New Yorker or CNN or the Nation. So this really hit the TV and media, and it was a big time back in 2005 and 2006. And if it had been a vaccine against lung cancer or colon cancer, it would have been just this incredible miracle, and everyone would have probably bought stock in that company for that, but that's not what happened here. So the Wall Street Journal kind of nailed this. They said, Merck's going to have some tricky waters to get recommendations for routine HPV vaccine among young people and may face political concerns that the vaccine reduces health risk. You're going to get some concern because it reduces health risks because it's for sex for young people. Okay, so. And was this validated? I don't know. David Baltimore's a Nobel laureate, and he wrote at the same time, the HPV vaccine is a cancer vaccine, immensely effective, and we should be proud of this and excited. Has the potential to save hundreds of thousands of lives each year. And then we currently still have this senator. He's a physician. And premarital sex is dangerous, even deadly. Let's not encourage it by vaccinating 10-year-old so they think that they're safe. And this continues. And as a matter of fact, our current administration, national administration wants to go back to abstinence, and that's what's happening. So, teaching. So it's interesting to know scientific challenges preceded the social political challenges. There were barriers to getting this vaccine made. Each HPV type is unique, and so it was felt that not any single vaccine would cover all the 15 cancer-causing ones, so no single anti-vaccine was possible. They didn't think there'd be a lot of cross-immunity between one HPV type and another. So you needed a vaccine against many types or polyvalent. And so the first FDA-approved vaccine in 2006 was against 16 and 18. I think I've showed you pretty good examples why that is, because those cause 70+% of the cancers. And 6 and 11, which, Merck never came out and said why they picked 6 and 11. That just causes warts. But warts are a huge issue, and for men and women. And I think that was part of how they were hoping that the vaccine would be given to both girls and boys. And then we have a newer Gardasil 9, which is against these 4 and 5 other cancer-causing HPV. So between 16, 18, and these 5, that's 90% of cervical cancers and other cancers in the world are caused by that. So this current vaccine should, in theory, eliminate cancer by 90% if it's widely given. It would probably take 10 or 20 years before we'll see this effect, because it takes that long for the cancers to develop. We don't usually see cancer of the cervix until people are in their 40s or beyond. So if you're vaccinating a 12-year-old right now, we probably won't see it for a long time, those changes. What's the vaccine? It's called a papilloma virus-like particle. So it's basically a car without an engine. So, if you were up in the sky looking at cars, you would say, oh yeah, I recognize that. Your immune system would say, I see that's a red Corvette down there, or that's a blue Buick or something like that. But inside there's no engine, there's no DNA, it's empty, there's no genetic material, so it can't infect you, which is one of the concerns. So here's a nice schematic. So this is a native HPV. It's got its normal protein coding and its double-stranded DNA inside. And so if this infects a cell, this takes over and reproduces itself. Well, if you cut out just a single bit of DNA that codes for these green proteins, and you put it into a big vat of yeast that you program to reproduce a lot of this, it makes a ton of just these viral particles. And one of the most serendipitous discoveries was that if you put this into the right environment, it self-assembles into a little particle that's identical to this, except there's no genetic material. Then you inject it, and the immune system is ready to fight it off, but it's not infectious. So it's really quite unique. So this was from the New England Journal, a picture of these viral particles without any DNA, and this is just sort of a native what the virus looks like normally. So in the United States, our Advisory Committee on Immunization Practice came out in 2006 and said, we got to routinely vaccinate everyone. And this is the more updated version, but at age 11 or 12. And people are like, why 11 or 12? Well, the vaccine doesn't work great if you use it after sexual exposure. Once the cat's out of the bag, it's just not all that effective. And there's something unique about 11 and 12-year-olds versus 15, 16, even 17-year-olds in their immune response. It's a more robust immune response for whatever reason. And so this turns out to be the best age time. So it's recommended for women starting, girls at this age up through 26, and for men starting at this age up to 21. And it's recommended for men through the age of 26 if they're having sex with other men versus just the 21 because of additional protections for them. But if you really want it to work, you give it to a young, even if you think you have, your little Sally or Johnny is not going to have sex until they're 21 or 30 or whatever, you'd still want to give it to them now because that's the best immune response. So here we go back. So in The Nation magazine in 2005, you had Bridget Maurer from the Family Research Council. Giving an HPV vaccine to young women could be potentially harmful. because they may see it as a license to engage in premarital sex. Well, Katha Pollitt said, raise your hand if you think that what's keeping girls virgins now is the threat of getting cervical cancer when they're 60 from a disease they've never probably heard of. I mean, seriously, I don't think that, teenagers that aren't making necessarily high-level decision-making, that they're thinking about, oh my goodness, now I'm free to have sex because I'm not going to get cervical cancer in the future, So, one of the things that have come up, there's a large group in the United States and other countries that's very much against vaccination in general, and part of it is, safety and effectiveness, and there's been a lot of stuff online about that. So, is HPV vaccine effective? Is it safe? Well, we won't know its effectiveness against cervical cancer for probably another decade, but we do know its effect on precancer, which is usually you have to have precancer before you get cancer, and we know its effect on warts. So when, in 2015, this review of 20 studies in 9 high-income countries, and in the countries that had greater than 50% coverage, meaning that these young women and men were having at least half of the population getting vaccinated in these people, they found that HPV 16 and 18 prevalence had decreased by almost 70%. I mean, that's huge. And anal genital warts by 60%. And that there's what they call herd effect, meaning that if you have a large enough number of people immune, then even if a stray person comes in who's not immune, they can't really pass that virus around because everyone they come into contact with is already immune. And there was some evidence of cross protection, which was great because it wasn't sure that that would happen. So here's dramatic. This is, again, just looking at in Australia, which has a high rate of utilization of the vaccine since 2006. But this is the number. This is genital warts, again, because we don't be too many years before cervical cancer. But just to show how effective the vaccine. When they took the young folks that were getting vaccinated versus the middle-aged folks that some were vaccinated, some weren't, and then over 30s weren't getting the vaccine. So when they looked at the rate, if you were over 30 in 2004 versus over 30 in 2009, never got vaccinated, your rate of genital warts is flattish. But if you had gotten the vaccination in 2006 because you were under 21, you see this plummet in warts. They almost never see warts anymore in Australia, and the same thing goes for the men, so highly effective. If you look, this is a little bit of an old slide, I didn't put the date in, but if you look at, originally the first recommendations was for 3 different vaccine shots, one initially 2 months and then 6 months later. They were saying what percentage of people in Australia that were, girls in the age group and boys in the age group to get the vaccine got the full vaccine coverage. Well, 71.2, that's pretty good. In the United Kingdom, 60%. And here we are at the United States, leading the charge of good scientific evidence here at 33, a third of girls in these high-income countries. And you might say, well, it's because people don't like vaccines in the U.S. Well, that's not true, because here's the slide that shows that for your regular other appropriate childhood vaccinations, like pertussis and tetanus, 86% are getting vaccinated in 2013, but only 13% of boys, all of them should be getting it, are getting 3 doses, and only 34% of girls are getting all 3 doses, and half will get a single dose. And so it's not that people don't want vaccination, it clearly has to do with that it's the HPV vaccine, unfortunately. So back to abstinence, this is what's been coming out. This is Leslie Unrun from the Abstinence Clearinghouse. And abstinence supporters have been arguing that eliminating the threat of infection would only encourage teenagers to have sex. And HPV is not prevented by... Well, people have done some studies that have looked to see if this is changing sexual behavior at all, being vaccinated or not, and there's 0 evidence that if a child at 11 or 12 is vaccinated, that it changes how they behave sexually at 15, 16, 17, 20. So this, I personally object to vaccinating children when they do not need vaccination, particularly against a disease that is 100% preventable with proper sexual behavior. Well, C. Everett Koop, who was Surgeon General during the AIDS epidemic and was really a remarkable human being at what he did around HIV, had come out with a statement regarding abstinence, and this is his quote, but basically the gist of it was that, clearly abstinence, there's little evidence of preventing premarital sex. So but if you pledge abstinence, it does reduce contraception use and sexually transmission infection prevention, because when a person who pledges abstinence then actually has sex, they're unprepared. And so one thing that he had learned is that belief doesn't really change reality. Unfortunately, abstinence, the evidence is very clear, just does not work to prevent sex. So, overview of quadrivalent vaccine safeties. This is from when it was initiated widely after the first scientific trials to 2015. It's been approved in over 133 countries. Almost 200 million doses have been distributed as of December, so well over that number by now. 15 studies, over 1 million pre-adolescent, adolescent women from various countries. So fainting, and that's true with all vaccines. When you give someone a shot, often they faint. And then possible skin reactions, again, which local skin reaction is very common. So serious adverse events were extensively studied, and there's just no increased incidence of these events compared to background rates when people who weren't vaccinated. So extremely safe. So the HPV vaccine continues to work 10 years after the vaccination. There's done studies that have looked in women, they continue to have good immunity 10 years after vaccination, and that's great against precancers. And there is some cross protection against some of the other high risks, so that's also good news. So why is there controversy over a simple, safe, highly effective cancer prevention vaccine? I think James Trussell, director of the Office of Population Research at Princeton, sums it up well. It all comes down to the evils of sex. That's an ideological position impervious to empirical evidence. So basically, unfortunately. So this is wrapping it up here. Human papilloma virus, it's very ancient in its origins, and it's incredibly clever. I mean, it really is a remarkable virus to study and what's been done with it. And basically has done a lot of good, but also bad. But it also highlights science at its best and worst, and I think our society somewhat on its best and worst. Some of the things that went on with medical research and the ethics of that were challenging, but also, it's led to some life-saving changes. And we have a cancer vaccine that's highly effective, but it's, underused in the U.S. And, honestly, if we had a vaccine against breast or colon or prostate cancer, there would be no controversy and everyone would get it. It's a huge tragedy. And the American Cancer Society and some of the other national cancer societies are now, in the last couple of years, really aggressively pushing. This is a cancer vaccine. You do not want your children or your anyone to get cancer, and we need to be using it and sort of trying to get away from this whole, sexually transmitted controversy. So, and there is a healthy, happy cervix. All right, all you wanted to know in one hour or less. Sorry, I hope that wasn't too much jumping around. So.
If people have questions, you can raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you.
That's all right, I'll shout. I'm a big mouth.
Okay.
Is it okay to give this vaccine to children younger than those two ages?
The question is it okay to give vaccine? You can give it as early as 9. It was studied at age 9. There's not a lot of benefit in giving the immune system and other hormonal changes that are going on probably in the peri-adolescent time frame. It makes the most sense to do 11 and 12, but you can give it as early as 9.
So the immune system has to get to a certain level?
Well, kids have great immune systems. I mean, they're designed to be challenged and that sort of thing. But I think, within reasonableness and sexual exposure would be rare before age 9, except in an abuse, obviously, situation. And so that. And the other thing that's very important, and I alluded to it earlier, is the transformation zone, the part of the cervix that's extremely vulnerable to HPV, that as you start going through puberty, that is when it goes through this thing called metaplasia. As your hormones go higher in women, vaginal acid gets lower and you get this sort of metaplastic change. And so that's really the time, you want to make sure that vaccine's on board before that occurs, because that's when you're most, so a lot of kids that have been sexually abused, young women as like 3, 4, 5-year-olds, they just don't have the HPV problem that you do once you hit adolescence, and it's because of that biological change, so that's part of it too. Yeah.
Please use the mics. Please use the mic.
Thanks. Is it in any way detrimental to use Gardasil, like vaccinate first with just Gardasil and then later vaccinate with Gardasil 9 for the 2nd and 6 months?
Yeah, so now you only, in women, need, in girls, to use the 2 doses, the Gardasil 9. They found that even 1 dose is highly effective, extremely effective, and 2 doses certainly equivalent to 3 doses. But yeah, I don't even know that the Gardasil, the quadrivalents, I don't think it's even available anymore. As soon as the Gardasil 9 came out, people used up what was left of the Gardasil 4. So currently, if you're going to be vaccinated, what's available is the Gardasil 9, and I would highly recommend using that. It's, it's covering 90% of the cancer-causing HPV and the 6 and 11, the wart-causing HPV. So.
For a young person who got the vaccine when it first came out, would you recommend that they get the new one with the more coverage?
Yeah. So the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices and the Centers for Disease Control have come out and addressed that. So if you haven't completed your series, you would complete it with the Gardasil 9 and not use the 4 one. They don't recommend that people who've completed a series with either one get an additional, but certainly if you had a young person come who had an initiated sexual activity, whereas under the age of 26, we would give a single dose of the Gardasil 9 if they would, but we're not actively pursuing to do that to get that little extra 20%, because there is some cross immunity and other things, and it just isn't cost effective. But.
Are you monitoring it to see if in 15 or 20 years out there needs to be a booster or something
Yes.
like that?
And so the 10-year data suggests, when they look at serum immunity levels, that it's still robust. So at least at 10 years, and there's a little bit longer data from the trials, but the trials were so small relative to the number of people vaccinated in 2006 and beyond. But but people have thought about that, and it might be that at some point you need immunity. We do know that HP exposure, the bulk of it is in the sort of teen and 20s, and less so as you get into your 30s and 40s. So it will probably be less needed at that point for other reasons. But.
I have a couple questions. The first one, if a woman has genital warts and she gives birth, does that increase for the offspring coming through the vaginal canal?
Yeah, there's very rare cases of a respiratory papilloma virus from HPV in newborns. It's incredibly rare compared to the number of babies that are probably exposed to genital HPV and genital warts. It's so rare that they don't recommend like C-section or avoiding a vaginal delivery. If someone has a lot of bulky disease, a lot of warts, then sometimes we'll try and treat it before delivery. And often in pregnancy, warts grow because of some of the hormonal and immune changes that occur in pregnancy. But honestly, we don't see the volume of warts that we used to, and I'm hoping as people get vaccinated, like Australia, we'll see it less and less. But yeah, and it can be a problem. Babies, it's very rare, but they sometimes need to have laser treatment. And it's not the cancer-causing type of problem, but it can be a problem for if they get that.
My second question is, if a woman's had a complete hysterectomy, should she still continue to have pap smears?
So if she's never had cervical problems, cervical dysplasia or cervical cancer, then the recommendations are not to do. Vaginal cancer is incredibly rare, and so the only people we tend to do vaginal pap smears on are, and the guidelines and science support that, are women who've had high-grade cervical dysplasia or cancer in the past, and then we will follow them afterwards with vaginal pap smears.
From what I've read, and you mentioned it too, it said that, well, what I've always read is almost all cervical cancers are caused by HPV, sexual HPV. I think you mentioned 90%. So what is the other?
Well, when they've done huge studies, it's close to 99%, but
So what would be that other? I've never been able to find anything that would tell me what that other cause is.
So some women, have unusual types of cancers of their cervix. Women that were DES exposed, diethyl esterbitol that was used in the 40s and 50s can get these unusual vaginal and cervical cancers.
Okay.
And then it's just the same as you getting like a regular skin cancer. It could just be bad luck with how your cellular DNA divides, and you get this sort of two-hit defect in that. But it's pretty rare. But there are some rare types of cervical cancer. The glandular cell cancers of the center of the cervix. Other sort of rare types of skin cancer, and you could get an occasional, like the vulva. A third of vulvar cancers are not HPV, but they're squamous cell cancers, most of them, which just means that, as your cells divide over time, just like in your colon and other places, they can have a mistake in their replication and end up with a cancer or some other chemical, or you might have someone whose immune system or their tumor suppressor genes are faulty, and so they're more predisposed to cancers.
Okay, thank you. And then follow up to that, hypothetically speaking, if a girl and grows into a woman and has been chaste, and she marries a boy, grows into a man who has been chaste, and they stay faithful to each other through life, is she pretty much safe then from contracting cervical cancer?
Yeah,
Hypothetically speaking.
I think in theory, yes, it should be sort of like the nun, who's never had sexual intercourse and that type of thing. I had just recently a couple, that they were sure they had never had sex with anyone else, and she has HPV. That's molecularly clear. We've had several tests, so it's, the question then becomes, and I deal with this every day in the office, is, is there a new exposure that someone's not discussing? Or is it some freak event that happened? HPV does not seem to be one of these things that are transmitted well on objects or like, fomites like toilet seats or, bathing suits or in pools or things like that. So I think it would be exceedingly rare that would be a source usually for that. But could it be possible, a 1 in a billion chance that, someone got something exposed to some HPV from some object, maybe, but I think that would be pretty unusual. So it would be pretty, if it's truly HPV-related disease, it would be pretty hard that someone hadn't had some exposure. And a lot of women, unfortunately, and men have been sexually abused and blacked that out. They don't have a recall, so something could have been dormant or latent for years, and a lot of women get raped, and that's completely been pushed to the back. So, in theory, if you had an isolated box and these two people were raised in that box and they only had sex with each other, then,
but it does lessen the chance a great amount also.
Oh yeah, and we see it. I see
and
it all the
especially
time.
even if they become sexually active in their 20s, it
Yeah.
still is
Yeah.
a lot more protective than young teens, and teens having
Absolutely
having sex.
right.
So.
But not as protective as
Thank
the
you.
vaccine.
No, I'm not an anti-vaxxer.
I'm not saying that. I'm just
I'm just trying to get the information.
I'm just a little sensitive to the vaccines. Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand the age drop-off of efficacy, and like, if you're not vaccinated by a certain age, what's the rationale for not becoming so? At what point does the costs outweigh the benefits, and why?
So the studies went to age 26, and then after it became very efficacious, you can imagine that the pharmaceutical companies were all like, this is great, let's give it to 30 and 35 and 40-year-olds. So they did trials in the sort of over 30 and 40-year-old women and men, mostly women, but to see, it, was it efficacious? And it was so incredibly not efficacious that the cost benefit, and it was a costly vaccination, continues to be a costly vaccination, that all the national people that make up guidelines said, there's just no reason, we're not saving lives here, and we're spending a lot of money to give vaccinations to people over 30.
So that's true of both transmission risk and cancer risk? And I mean, I think it would probably be worth seeing it in, males, because I don't think it's great to be a vector for the disease.
Right,
but,
and it's interesting, Elliot Barr, who was the head researcher at Merck, likened men to mosquitoes with malaria, that we should target the people that are bringing the infection, to, as equally, and I see it in the office all the time, these women sitting there and they've been tested and told they have HPV and HPV-related disease, and yet the men they've had sex with, or their boyfriends or husbands or whatever, are sort of the innocent bystander, even though they probably either brought it in to the relationship, or maybe the woman did, but certainly men are involved at some point in time, but they're not tested. It's so rare, penile and anal cancer, that it's just not, as it currently is not hitting and men don't tend to visit the doctor for genital issues in that age group, except for like chlamydia and gonorrhea and stuff like that. So it's a tough one, because the burden is on women to then disclose with sexual partners and carry this burden of like, I have this HPV, and where a lot of men have it too, obviously, but they don't know they have it, so they're sort of not caught up in having to disclose that and to make decisions about it. And unfortunately, condoms don't prevent transmission, because it lives in all the genital skin, vulva, scrotum, and things. And so if you have a total body condom, it would work, but
At what rate would the vaccination have to be in order to have true herd immunity? And at that point, would we still do pap smears and other tests?
Yeah. So it's hard to know at what point. I mean, the studies from those countries that had over 50% was starting to see some herd immunity, but we've seen it, certainly with like measles, mumps, and rubella, when we have these outbreaks in communities that don't have a lot of vaccination, it sort of is confined to that community really, and doesn't seem to get beyond that border, but it's pretty devastating for the group that's within that. So, you have to have herds amongst herds amongst herds. I mean, it depends on your region, but I would think probably at least 50 to 60%, but I don't know, and what the amount would have to be. But I think, we are seeing, if you get to the 60, 70% like the UK and Australia, you're really seeing a real drop in some of this. The pap smear, I think, is here for a while. How often we do the pap, it's being spaced out, and when you start it might be different if you have a high number of people vaccinated. And we may go to primary HPV testing. We just skip the whole pap smear, where we're just testing for different subtypes of HPV. And only if you test positive and you're persistently positive, then you come in either for pap smear or for some sort of colposcopy or something. But we're not yet to eliminating that. But it's great for women who've been vaccinated that are having less abnormal paps, less colposcopy, less of their cervix removed. I mean, it's just, the impact's tremendous. Oh, sorry.
Hi. So I was in Kenya recently assessing the market demand for a device that could help screen for cervical cancer. So my question is more about secondary prevention. So they were using visual inspection by acetic acid, right? So it was new to me, a test that you could see sort of real time whether or not you had some precancerous lesion. Is that ever an option when you see patients here in the U.S. as opposed to a PAP, where you?
Right. So I wouldn't ever use that here in the U.S. because we have a very robust cytology program. So the Pap smear is much more accurate, and the HPV testing is much more accurate. The VIA, the visual inspection with acetic acid, unfortunately is very what we call non-specific. So there's a lot of things on the cervix that might come up white looking when you put acetic acid on it, and then you say, okay, and we're going to treat that. But they've done cost benefits in countries that are resource poor, and what happens is if you end up treating 10 or 20% of folks with a treatment at age 30, say, you screen everyone at 30, and then you treat anyone who has the visual thing, you'll save a lot of lives, but you've treated a lot of women that may not have needed the treatment. So versus treating everyone, which would be, people had where you either freeze or burn the part of the cervix that's vulnerable. So, but that from a cost, effective strategy, it's a one-stop shopping. And the problem with cytology is you have to come back. You get the Pap smear. It has to be fixed and read by a very expensive and intensive process for trained cytologists to look at that. Whereas this is just kind of, but if you're going to put money anywhere, you'd vaccinate. You'd give everyone a single dose of the HPV vaccine at age 9 or 10 in those countries.
Use the mic, please.
Oh.
I was saying, in a rural setting where there might just be a one visit,
right,
would a VIA be indicated?
Could one in theory do that in the United States? You could, but we're this nation of excess. We spend so much on the most incredible stuff, and a Pap smear is pretty cheap. And as long as you can get someone back, and it takes 10 or 20 years to develop cancer, as long as you're every 5 years getting a Pap and an HPV, if you took 100 women and you put acetic acid on them at age 30 in a rural community and 10% end up having their cervix treated when only 1% needed to be, that doesn't seem very cost effective. But if you're in the middle of a country that has no cytology, has no other resources, and you may never see this person but once, I can see where that makes sense.
So I just wondered if in the future at all you foresee a greater focus and more research on testing and treating people assigned male at birth for HPV at all.
Could you say that one more time? Testing and treating someone?
If in the future you foresee any more focus on people assigned male at birth being tested and treated for HPV and a greater focus on prevention in them.
Well, it's FDA approved for all, no matter what your assigned sex or gender identification is at 11 to 12 to get the vaccination. So I think if we do that, and there's such little, disease in men, except now there's an increase in the oral pharyngeal throat, but if they get this 16 vaccine, that should be unlikely. So I don't see that we're going to do necessarily more testing in, individuals that are male gender or, the sex male, sex gender at birth or sex of the male, whatever. Sorry. I see a lot of, I didn't OBGYN, but go ahead, sorry.
How powerful do you think that the anti-vaccination effect is in Vermont right now? I know we have anti-vaxxers in certain areas, but do you see this at your level, and how powerful is that?
Not so, the legislature passed some, it used to be you could opt out of routine vaccinations for many reasons now, and that's changed a little bit so that it's a little more stringent for all types of vaccination for kids they're going to school type of thing. So I don't see that it's a huge group here in Vermont per se. I think that it's been harder in a lot of the education because it was the pediatricians, that are seeing the 11, 12-year-olds, and they just weren't prepared to have some of these conversations. So there's been a lot of teaching and a lot of emphasis on sort of the language and sort of what you're saying to parents when you're recommending this vaccinate, and even the discomfort of even bringing the subject up initially. But I think that we've come a long way with that nationally and even here in Vermont. So I think, that it's, Vermonters tend to be more reasonable. I mean, they are, I think a little less swayed sometimes by some of the national figures that are highly anti-vaccination, but, it's, I don't have data on that.
It just seems that all along the vaccination has always been controversial. And I remember when it first came out, my sister-in-law had a daughter in the age group, and she was vehemently against it. And I don't think it was the sex issue. I think it was just she didn't want her daughter to be a guinea pig, and that type of thing. But I know when it first came out, it was just recommended for girls. And I had boys, so I felt fortunate that I didn't have to deal with the controversy or anything. But when did it come out that boys should start being vaccinated also? Because I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, initially it had been studied and certainly was available. The Committee on Immunization Practice didn't address that so strongly initially, but they did say girls and boys initially. But it wasn't, states weren't mandating it and that sort of thing. But certainly by 2014, it was very clear. And I think it was more like 2009 or 10, but I don't remember the exact date. But I mean, the very first year, that wasn't so much on the plate. Mm-hmm.
Was the side effect of fainting at the time of injection, or was it were there episodes during the course of the vaccination?
At the time of injection, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Wegner, for the talk.